this is an audience of New York Jews. And that identity, being a New York Jew, is something that I think you all probably have thought about in some way, shape, or form. But the phrase New York Jew, oddly enough, is no longer in common usage. And it has a long history. The phrase itself begins to be used over a century ago. There in 1905, for example, there will be a publication entitled The New York Jew. In 1914, a very interesting article that I found that I'm working with, written by a guy named Stanley West in Minneapolis, writes an article for a non-Jewish, a Christian magazine, entitled The New Jerusalem, right, from Minneapolis, looking at what's going on in New York City in 1914. And the gist of it is that the Jews are taking over. I mean, there's a little tint of anti-Semitism in it, but otherwise it's making an observation that at the very least demographically, and he will speak in other ways as well, at the very least in terms of population, the Jews are conquering that city. They are making it their own. They are turning it into the New Jerusalem. And in fact, Stanley West was correct in that during the 20th century, New York City becomes not just a great Jewish city, but it becomes the great Jewish city of the entire history of the diaspora. Now that may sound exaggerated, may sound hyperbolic to you, but once again, as we learn together this morning some of this history, you're going to come to a better appreciation of just how historically significant New York City has been and continues to be in the history of the Jews and of Jewish life, and why it then confers a special identity, the identity of being a New York Jew, and what that may mean along the way. So that's, we will touch on some of the history, I think, in the description. I advertised this class as an overview of all of New York Jewish history, and we'll certainly do that briefly. But really, to be honest, that's the description if this were to be a full course rather than just one Limmud session. So we don't really have time to go through the entire history. But one big question that I'd like to cover with you today is, what does that mean, a great Jewish city? What does it mean to be a Jewish city? Well, that's right. Some people have, that's the slightly negative side of it, right? And the article I mentioned had a little bit of that fearfulness about New York becoming too Jewish, right? And there have been Jewish leaders that have had the same fear as well. So there is sometimes a kind of a negative slant to this, and we'll speak to that as well. But the basic question, and by the way, I have a book at home that just demonstrates this beautifully. Remember Harry Golden, the popular Jewish author? So he had a book he put out in the early 70s entitled The Greatest Jewish City in the World. It was his ode to New York City. So once again, what constitutes a great Jewish city? I'm going to suggest 3 factors in particular, and we're going to go through them. You may have noticed that I'm offering 3 sessions today at Limmud. Each one of the sessions is going to emphasize one of them. So I don't expect everyone to come back for all 3. You're all welcome, of course, but they do fit together, these 3 sessions. Before I get into that, let's just talk a little bit, and here I'm putting on my Jewish historian hat. Let's talk a little bit about Jews and cities in general, because I think that's also critical to this question. You may be aware, probably are aware, that throughout our diaspora history, right, when we lived in the land of Israel, we lived in both cities and towns and villages. We were a nation that had merchants in the cities and farmers in the, out in the countryside, right? We were that kind of varied society. That changes very quickly once we live in diaspora. And from the time of the Babylonian exile through our dispersion, where the word diaspora comes from, our dispersion around the world, we have almost always, there are always exceptions, but for the most part, we have settled in cities. That's to say that Jews have a very long time relationship with cities and city living. That's because we're cosmopolitan, or
We're rootless cosmopolitan.
right. So thank you, Linda. The term, and this is a very modern term, it actually comes out of the discourse of modern anti-Semitism, to accuse the Jews of being rootless, right? They're wanderers. They have no real home, right? Obviously, the Zionist will then come along and say, we do have roots, we do have home, right? But then the other part of that, calling them cosmopolitan, was also a kind of a put down, because it meant that they didn't have the family values of small town living, right? They were modern, urban and urbane people who were highfalutin intellectuals, right? All of that was leveled as a kind of accusation. I would take the similar observation and turn it around and turn it into something good. So let's do that with your permission. Yes, ma'am.
They
Yes.
weren't allowed to own land.
That is a big part of it, but I think that trope, that sentiment that we repeat, has a lot of truth in it. Just to repeat it, one of the reasons that when we look at the Jewish economic profile throughout diaspora history, and we see that it leans so heavily toward commercial pursuits, buying and selling, importing, exporting, being a merchant, right? That is the majority of kinds of work, the kinds of livelihood that Jews will gravitate to. The built-in accusation is, well, why didn't they work the land like real people, right? And the answer we almost always give is that there was legal discrimination against them, preventing them from owning land. That's true to a point. But what that obscures is the simple choice. People choose with their feet where Jews choose to live and what occupations they chose to pursue was also largely a matter of volition, of their own choice, by virtue of being a diaspora people. That's the key. So yes, there will be various forms of legal discrimination at various times in various places, but what is the rule throughout is that this is a group that has moved far from its original homeland, that is living without the rootedness of speaking the language of the place, having communal memory in that place, having a sense of belonging to that place. And it is in cities where those qualities are consoled, conciliated. Being rootless, to use Linda's term again, one seeks a congenial place to be. A city is going to offer that for a few simple reasons. One is simply that cities, by definition, are places with large populations that are diverse. So if you are an outsider, well, it's more comfortable to be in a city with a lot of other outsiders. Very simple, right? But there's a truth to that. That's number one, is the diversity offered by a city. We Jews love that, right? Because think about it. If you go to live in Nebraska, where everybody has the same hair color, everyone looks alike, except for you, right? Your Jewish comfort level is very different in the middle of Nebraska than it is in the middle of New York. And once again, this is all fairly obvious, but needs to be stated. Number two, and the other second quality of a city, is it's a commercial center. Right? If Jews, due to basic need, due to the conditions of their lives, gravitated toward commercial pursuits, the city is the place to be. That's where business gets done. So Jews are inclined to business. They therefore move to cities. Living in cities, they become further inclined to business. Okay, once again, not across the board, not all Jews, but a significant percentage. That's two. Three is the cultural capital of a city. A city, because it's diverse, because it is a marketplace, is also a marketplace for ideas and for culture and for the arts. And Jews, too, as a literate people, as a people who bring their highly literate, very study-based religion with them wherever they go, also end up feeling more comfortable in an environment that has higher cultural aspirations and so forth. So I would boil it down to those three qualities: the demographic diversity of a city, the commerce that cities provide and foster, and the cultural lives of cities. All three provide a more congenial, more comfortable home for Jews, and therefore throughout our lengthy history, we have more, there are exceptions to prove the rule, but more often than not, we have chosen to live in cities rather than elsewhere. We have been urban rather than rural. Now this is significant for many reasons, one of them being it's yet another way that Jews have differentiated themselves from non-Jews. Until the modern era, in fact, one of the things that qualifies it as pre-modern is that most people did not live in cities. Historically, city living was the exception. The majority of the human population lived in towns, villages, farmland, etc. And the cities, which were not nearly as big as they've become, were the exceptional case. So Jews, in gravitating to that, were making themselves exceptional and also developing a tradition of knowing what to do and how to live in an urban environment. When we get to the modern period, therefore, one of the key elements of modernity, one of the principal processes of modernization is something called urbanization. Urbanization due to the Industrial Revolution and other trends as well, other economic trends. It is only in the modern era, we're talking about the last 400 years, 400 years is the modern era. It's only for the past 3, 4, maybe 5 centuries that cities have grown as large as they have become. And in the process, more and more, a higher percentage of people have moved to cities. So it's only in the modern era that city living has become normal and the majority case. Right? So it's a reverse. Pre-modern, most people lived outside of cities. The modern world, most people live in cities. Right? This, again, should all be familiar. Once again, the implication for Jews is fascinating. It means that of this basic element of modernity, Jews are already there. Jews have already learned how to make use of a city, how to build a good Jewish life in a city, how to interact with all of those other people, how to make it work politically, economically, culturally. All of those traditions of urbanism are already in the Jewish DNA. This goes a long way toward explaining why so many Jews have been so successful in the new culture of the new modern city. When emancipated Jews in Europe during the course of the 19th century found their way into all of the new professions and all of the new forms of media, such as journalism, newspapers, psychology, psychoanalysis, literature, theater, this burst of cultural energy in the 19th century in cultural capitals such as Berlin and Vienna and so forth, it should be no surprise that many, sometimes most of the people in those various fields were Jews. Is this making sense so far? So everyone with me so far? Okay, good. So that's, and one last thing I'll say on the history of Jews in cities is that how many people have grandparents, great-grandparents that came from Russia, Poland, Lithuania, et cetera, right? Yiddish-speaking immigrants who came a century ago, right? We're in 2018, so it was 1917 and the couple decades around that when most of our grandparents arrived here, right? That was the era of mass immigration to this country, and we'll talk more about that because it will have very important implications for New York City, right? But it is in that wave that we built a memory of having come not from big cities, but from where we tend to remember our grandparents came from. The shtetl, the shtetlach of the Pale of Settlement. Here again is proof of my thesis, right? We usually think, oh, well, we were all like Tevye, right? We all came from a village. The historical truth of the matter is that the Pale of Settlement was only created around the year 1800 by the Russian czars as a country-sized ghetto, precisely because they wanted to prevent Jews from pouring into the cities as they knew they would. How can we keep them out of Moscow and Leningrad? Or it wasn't called Leningrad, St. Petersburg. How can we keep them out of our big cities? We don't want that pernicious Jewish influence in our cities as they grow, as we enter the modern age. So they created a ghetto called the Pale of Settlement. Jews were, here's an example of legal discrimination. Jews had no choice but to live in those areas. They developed a new form of Jewish community living in those areas. Notice they did not join the peasants and become farmers. What did they do? Forced to live in rural areas, what did they do? They created little towns. The shtetl was an urban microcosm. Proof positive that Jews naturally not only gravitate to cities, but when given the opportunity, they create their own little cities. That's the shtetl. So I urge you all to replace your memory, our cultural memory, our collective memory of the shtetl as rural, pastoral, a beautiful place in nature. There's some truth to that, but there's much greater truth in terms of the urban style living that Jews created. And once again, once those people left and came to the big cities of the West, whether it is Hamburg or London or New York, they felt right at home. And by feeling right at home, they were able to make the adjustment all the more easily, often more easily than their fellow immigrants. There are other reasons that set apart the Jewish immigrant community from other immigrant communities, but that's one that I think gets less play than it's deserved. And that is there was something natural, something TV about city life for Jews. Question, yes?
Well, also from back then, most Jews were Orthodox, and to be able to walk to synagogue, you couldn't have a farm that was 3 miles away.
Absolutely, yes.
So that's a religious requirement to be in villages.
Yeah, so Mark, thank you. You're absolutely right. And once again, there is a lot of truth in that Jew, there was a famous anthropological study of life in the shtetl called Life is with People, right? And one of the points they make in that book is precisely what you've just said. And you've said that you've had that thought before. We've all had that thought before. Because we have to live close to shul, it means that we all have to live together. No question that plays a part. I just don't want you to use that as the overarching explanation. There are all sorts of issues that come into play, but that certainly is one of them. Okay. Let me now get back to my original question. What makes New York City the great Jewish city, the greatest Jewish city in my contention? The 3 criteria are these. I've already touched on, and we're going to talk more today about population. Size matters when it comes to Jewish life. Okay, so we're going to talk about that issue of numbers and residential concentration, the density of Jewish life in New York. That's number 1, and that's going to be our topic for the rest of the day, but I want to tell you what the other 2 are, so if you'd like, you're welcome to come to our later sessions. Number 2 is something that sets New York apart pretty clearly, and that is the level of cultural engagement with the greater general culture, and hence the extraordinary contribution that Jews will make to that greater culture. In 20th century New York, we're talking about the pop culture, the popular culture for all America and ultimately for the entire world. A film critic named Neil Gabler wrote one of the key books in this regard. Subsequent scholars have critiqued him for overstating it, but nevertheless, he still taught us something important, and that was, the title of the book was An Empire of Their Own. Has anyone read it? Anyone know this book? The subtitle is more telling. The subtitle is How the Jews Invented Hollywood. Right? And again, this is probably a trope that you have heard yourself, that of everyone, without exception, every one of the founding studios of the Hollywood film system, Warner Brothers, MGM, Fox, right, et cetera, Universal, every one of those studios was founded by an immigrant Jew. As Neil Gabler likes to point out, they all were born within a 60-mile radius in Poland. They all came to New York as immigrants, started looking for a way to make a living. One became a glove salesman, one became a furrier, right? They all went into one business or another, but ultimately found their way to a new business. And the timing is important. Anyone know when Thomas Alva Edison invented the movie projector? That was one of Edison's inventions. The whole movie industry is due to that invention, right? 18, what, I heard something?
You said 90.
Good, yes, good guess, sir. Yeah, did you know or you guessed?
Yes.
Excellent guess, good for you. It was in 1894 that Edison first has a public demonstration of this newfangled contraption of his. It's a big event in New York City. People flock to see it. That's the beginning of the movies. The fact that that's also the same moment that we have literally millions of Jews pouring into this new city is serendipitous, because some of those Jews will look at this new industry, this new technology, and will say, aha, this could be a business. There's a wonderful story that often attributed to the mother of the Warner brothers, but I think it was someone else. But let's say it was Ma Warner. She had 4 sons, looking what business should the boys go into. She found a business for them. She said, boys, open up a movie house. It's the only business where the customer pays before they see the merchandise. Okay? So the entry of Jews into these fields, into vaudeville, into the Tin Pan Alley and the music business, into comedy, into stage performance, into film, radio, television, is not because this was not in the Jewish DNA. This was an outgrowth of circumstance. It had to do with the timing. It had to do with what new technologies were available, what new businesses, which would not have been of any great interest to the aristocracy, the American elite at the time. It was left to a newcomer, an immigrant community, to latch on to these areas. So that's the second reason that New York is so important historically. If we trace the pop cultural contribution of Jewish New Yorkers through the 20th century, we have no choice but to be astounded by how much they contributed. Again, in performance, theater, Broadway, Hollywood, music, comedy, photography, fashion, the comics, cartooning, the list goes on and on. Each one of those areas become a major area of pop culture in the 20th century, and each one of those areas is, if not monopolized by Jews, then dominated by them. I'm not patting myself on the back and saying, gee, look how great Jews are. What I am doing is observing this disproportionate contribution and asking a historian's question, what explains this? One of the answers will be New York City. So that's a later session today. The third session is a third answer to the question, what makes New York such a great city? As you probably know, the original great city in Jewish experience was the city where Jews and Judaism were both born. It's called Jerusalem. As a result, in our dispersion away from the Holy Land, when we have settled in a city and made it a center of Jewish learning, of great rabbis and great yeshivot and great and high Jewish culture, we have at various times said, aha, this is a new Jerusalem. This is Vilna, is the Jerusalem of Lithuania. There was a time, believe it or not, where they called Brownsville in Brooklyn the Jerusalem d'America. Right? I want to suggest to you that that title really deserves to be applied to New York on the whole. New York is the great New Jerusalem in terms of Jewish life. Now, if you are dati, if you are a traditional Jew, you may say, well, most New York Jews have not been traditionalist. There's been a lot of not only reform and conservative reconstruction, but also a lot of secular Jewish life. So you may say, well, from that point of view, it represents a kind of decline, a diminution of true Yiddishkeit. That's not my point of view. My point of view, again, as a historian, is to celebrate Jewish diversity, innovation, attempts to rebuild, reconstruct Jewish life from door to door in each generation. And my interest is in looking at all of the extraordinarily inventive, creative, genius ways that Jews have done so throughout their history, and once again, over the last century in New York City. Almost every one of the religious movements of American Judaism has been born and raised in New York City. The one glaring exception is Reform Judaism, classical reform, took place mostly away from New York, especially in Cincinnati, Ohio. But even in terms of the history of Reform Judaism, there is a highly significant seminary that is created in New York by the great Reform Rabbi Stephen S. Wise. It was called the Jewish Institute of Religion. And I'm a former Hebrew Union HUC professor, so I know something about HUC. Hi there, I see a familiar face. JIR, which often in the official title of HUC today is HUC-JIR, no one knows much about or remembers much about JIR, and that's a shame because it was an extraordinary, path-breaking, innovative place that took Judaism to a new level in a new direction. And its history is part of American Judaism and specifically of New York Judaism. It's almost too obvious to have to point out the same is true, that New York is the crucible for conservative Judaism, Reconstructionist Judaism, modern Orthodoxy, much of ultra-Orthodoxy. The seminaries and yeshivot and generally the level of Jewish learning in this city does not equal or rival Jerusalem. But if we leave Israel aside, it is clearly the Jewish religious capital of the diaspora. Let's move beyond religion. Let's look at communal development. Let's look at philanthropies, Jewish hospitals, settlement houses, orphanages, all the various forms of social welfare that the Jewish community historically was responsible for creating, that not only gave a safe place for people in need, but also gave the rest of us a cause, gave the rest of us a way to come together as a community. One quick example, 1853 in New York City, there was a pressing need for a hospital that would serve Jews. Many Jews would not eat non-kosher food, so the Catholic-sponsored hospitals were a problem. Together with that, those hospitals were unwilling often to hire Jewish doctors. So let's kill two birds with one stone. Let's create a Jewish hospital. It was in 1853 that the Jews of New York came together, raised the funds, bought the land, built the building, hired the doctors, and built a brand new hospital. They called it, you're going to love this name. Anyone know what the name was? They called it Jews Hospital. I don't know why, but that name didn't last. Few years. I doubt it, but they did attempt to enable a patient who was Shomer Shabbat to be comfortable there. Yeah, I doubt they had Shabbat elevators. It was in the 40s, around Fifth Avenue in the 40s, that area. The name didn't last. It lasted less than a decade. They changed the name a few years later to Mount Sinai. So that's the origin of Mount Sinai. The important point, Mount Sinai is now a world-class hospital. I'm sure you've all heard of it. The key point is its origin as an expression of Jewish philanthropy, of tzedakah, and of the Jewish community of New York. That's early, right? That's long before the masses of people will descend. Imagine what will happen to the Jewish communal infrastructure over the course of the next century. So there will be, just to sum it up, there will be an extraordinary array of local Jewish communal organizations of every type and variety, on top of which, since New York is one of the great capitals of the world, on top of which there will also be the offices of many international Jewish organizations and agencies, making New York the de facto capital of the Jewish world. So that's the third thing that makes a great Jewish city, is having a great Jewish community. Again, to repeat, number one, the numbers. Number two, the cultural efflorescence. And number three, the communal structure of Jewish life. In every one of those three cases, New York is heads and tails above most other cities in history. In some of those areas, there are competitors. So for cultural engagement and contribution, you could look at Weimar-era Berlin was pretty impressive. The Russian city, Black Sea port city of Odessa was a pretty extraordinary place for Jewish intellectuals and poets and ideologues to gather together. And there are other cities throughout history that have been loci of Jewish culture as well as general culture. We might think about the convivencia between Jews, Christians, and Muslims in medieval Spain and Cordoba, capitals like that, where Jews were very much a part of the general culture. The third, the idea of an elaborate Jewish communal structure. Again, there are other examples in history, but no other city has all three. No other city in the history of the diaspora has had the extraordinary population density, has had the explosion into the general culture, and the internal reality of Jewish life and Judaism and Jewish culture. That New York scores so highly on all three, I think makes the case. And I could end there because I feel based on the looks, I've cowed you into submission. You're all willing to go along now, right? Before I move on, are there any questions? Yes.
You mentioned how in history there's been other Jerusalems in Europe. So where do you see New York City like, for the next 100 years?
It's a great. I'll repeat the questions. Okay. Yes, thank you. That's a great question. What I've been talking about is a historical observation. I'm talking primarily about the last century. And right now, we're going to spend the rest of our time talking about can someone time me, by the way, how much time do we have? We go until 10 o'clock?
Yes.
We have a half an hour. Great, that's perfect. So we're about to talk about the numbers, and one thing that I'll describe is how it reaches a height and then begins to decline. So certainly the last few decades of the 20th century were a time of numerical decline. A large part of that had to do with suburbanization. A large part of that had to do with people moving to the Sun Belt and to the West and so forth. And New York City, the vitality of Jewish New York will certainly go into decline as well. And yet, as is often the case, we see toward the end of the 20th century signs of a revival. And that revival, it continues in terms of cultural life and so forth. The big difference, and I think part of what's behind your question, the big difference is that we now have a much higher and ever-growing percentage of Orthodox Jews part of the larger picture. So what does that portend for the future? The other major trend of the last 20 years or so is the phenomenal rise of intermarriage. So in the non-Orthodox community, there has been a spike in interfaith marriage and all the implications of that. In the Orthodox community has grown in numbers and vitality at the same time. So to answer your question just very briefly, we now are in a moment, and looking ahead toward the future, we face the challenge of extreme polarization. Right? Our community, it's really hard to say we are one nowadays. So looking forward, that certainly does complicate issues. In terms of the centrality and the primacy of New York City, we'll come back to that. Hold me to that, because that's where I want to end today. Okay? Yes?
But in
Go ahead.
pre-World War II, there was a terrible anti-Jewish situation in the Bronx.
Let me.
Nazi rule.
The history of anti-Semitism is certainly an area of mine that I could speak to. Let me throw that to my colleague and my mentor and my teacher, Jonathan Sarna, who's at our conference as well. I'm sure many of you are planning to sit in his sessions. He has one session on anti-Semitism in historical perspective. So I would urge you to attend that session. I may be there as well. And we can put that question to him. Okay? Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, for sure. And then you.
I would just love to get your take on the qualitative shift from we were sort of a group of scrappy immigrant drivers, and you're suggesting that was part of the reason for the explosion to all these different areas.
David.
It was kind of an entrepreneurial mindset of how to make it, whether it was in the arts or in film or in business. And we are much more, as a group, established, educated. How much is going to be just kind of going along paths of, the tried and true, as opposed to kind of the creative alchemy going on? We have a lot of investment bankers now. We have a lot of people in very traditional paths. And are we going to sort of have less of a qualitative impact in the future?
Well, so thank you, Shira. Whether you're aware of it or not, you're asking a very big question, which is the question. The question was, as Jews have succeeded in American society and each generation has further Americanized. And Shira suggested that that means that more and more Jews are doing leading more conventional kinds of lives by virtue of having adopted more mainstream American values. And what does that portend for the future of Jewish creativity, radicalism, outsider perspective, et cetera, et cetera? Am I more or less? Once again, a very big question. We could spend an awful lot of time. Let me answer in two ways. One is to teach you a little basic sociology. Early in the 20th century, when all of these immigrant groups were new Americans, many sociologists said, well, not to worry, they will assimilate. And with each generation, they'll become less foreign, more American, and by the third or fourth generation at the latest, they'll be fully American, nothing to worry about. This was called the straight line theory of assimilation. And it does work for some immigrant groups. For other immigrant groups, it doesn't work so well. And so it was another historian named Marcus Hansen, a historian of American immigration, who suggested an alternative. It's come to be known as Hansen's Law. What Hansen said was that, as he sees it, what the second generation, and second generation is the children of the immigrants, right? Immigrants are the first generation. What Hansen said was what the second generation will try to forget, their parents' foreignness, the third may yet attempt to remember. In other words, it was a notion of cyclical movement rather than straight line. And once again, this applies to some groups better than to others. Guess which one applies best to the Jews? Right? There is in Jewish life, for a number of reasons, a tremendous amount of circularity of the application of Hansen's Law, of what my teacher Jonathan Sarno calls revival. Every other generation or so, there is a revival, and each revival is both an attempt to recreate the old and to create something new at the same time. So there is in Jewish life, we're standing in it. A Limmud conference. 20 years ago, this did not exist. So this very conference, I would put to you as a wonderful example of that kind of innovation, that kind of attempt to rebuild for the future and so forth. So that's one answer. The other answer is more interesting. I mean, all of those stockbrokers you referred to. I mean, I think there are an awful lot of contemporary Jews who have become very mainstream and very conventional, and God bless them. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think, though, there's something in Jewish life, in the Jewish experience, perhaps in Jewish tradition, that fosters a sense of, let's call it thinking outside the box. So for all the conventionality that you're concerned about, you're right that it's there, and it's perhaps worrisome in certain respects. But I think at the end of the day, I'm always constantly amazed at how many young Jews come along with great new ideas and great new visions and so forth, and where you'd least expect it, you find renewed energy in the Jewish community. So I'm a cockeyed optimist, I guess. Okay. Yes.
And observant Jewish life is very expensive, so it's understandable.
Well, that's another challenge. Yes, right, of course. I don't mean to suggest there aren't challenges, but yes. So 1868 is the decade, is right after the Civil War. And just thinking for a moment before the Civil War, there are Jews in New York from the very beginning. As I'm sure you're all aware, there was a small group of Sephardic refugees who land here in 1654. That's looked back at as the origin of the community. The likelihood is that those 23 left and others replaced them, but still that is the beginning of the Jewish history of Jewish settlement residents in New York. By the turn of the 18th century, a few decades later, New Amsterdam is now renamed New York. In the year 1700, there are probably fewer than 100 Jews in New York City, a drop in the bucket. Over the course of the 18th century, those numbers will grow a bit. Other Jewish communities are settled during the 18th century in Charleston, South Carolina, in Savannah, Georgia, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in Newport, Rhode Island, and in New York. Those are the 5 colonial Jewish settlements. Each one of them has 20 or 30 families, 50 or 60 or 70 individuals. None of them are very big. The numbers begin to grow in the decades following the American Revolution. Around the turn of the 19th century, around 1800, is when the immigration stream begins, and now we're into the thousands. There are now a couple of thousand Jews in New York, still a drop in the bucket, also not necessarily the largest Jewish community in the States. For a time, Charleston has that honor. A little bit later in the 19th century, Philadelphia will be the capital city of American Jews. By the time of the Civil War, however, New York roars into first place and will hold that position for the rest of our history. So looking at the statistics, you see that in the 1870s, there are, in those days, population estimation was an inexact science. That's why you have lots of possibilities here. We're talking about between 75 to 100,000 Jews. All over America, there are about 250,000. In the 19th century, most Jewish immigrants came from Central Europe. They come to be known as German Jews. Most of them don't speak Yiddish. Many of them speak German. And they may arrive in New York, but most of them then set off they follow the frontier. They follow manifest destiny across the continent, and they settle in cities like Detroit and Cleveland and Cincinnati and Chicago and further west to San Francisco and Portland, Oregon. There are Jewish communities all across this country, and yet in that same context, there are nearly 100,000 who live in New York City, and that is somewhere between 30 to 40%. Let's, for argument's sake, say a third of American Jews are still living in New York City during that time when we usually tell the story as one of dispersion across the country. Now that dispersion is important history. Every one of those communities has a worthwhile history. What gets obscured often is the 1/3 back in New York, because we're often so focused on Cincinnati and New Orleans and elsewhere. But the life of New York Jews during the 19th century has yet to be fully explored. And by the way, let me advertise a few new books that have just come out. I meant to mention earlier, do you guys need, or you're just joining, or you need to announce something? Oh, you're good? Okay, sorry. A couple of new books that are out I'd like to advertise. One is by my senior colleague, Deborah Moore, just published a book called Jewish New York. It is now the newest, the best one-volume history of this subject. It's largely based on a three-volume set she edited a few years back, done by 4 different historians. So this field is growing, and we now have new resources at hand, but I would still suggest there's still an awful lot of work to be done. Civil War is when things explode. Any idea why New York City grows so dramatically following the Civil War? What industry in particular I heard clothing and textiles. That's exactly right. During the Civil War, there was a need for ready-made clothing, uniforms, and also regular clothing. The ready-to-wear clothing business emerges out of the Civil War. It is not a total monopoly of German Jews, but they dominate. Most of these new clothing manufacturer companies are in the hands of German Jews, and most of those will be centered in New York City. So in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, even prior to the mass immigration, there is this development of a new industry which helps to turn New York City into a major metropolis. And it's just at that moment that people to work in the factories begin arriving en masse. Between 1880 and the early 1920s, those 4 decades is called the period of mass migration. Some 20 million mostly Europeans, will leave the old world behind, make their way across the ocean. Many of them will pass first through the immigration center at Castle Garden and then later at Ellis Island. And we in America have an extraordinarily large new group of new Americans. Of that 20 million, most of them were from Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, kind of a little bit less the Western European. Western European were the Irish and Germans who had come in the 19th century. Now we're getting Poles, Italians, Hungarians, etc. Of those 20 million, fully 10% were Jews. There were only 5 million or so Jews in Eastern Europe. 2 million come to these shores. It is an extraordinary movement of people, of human capital, and of Jewish life. Cannot be overstated, the revolutionary quality of that human movement. Let me add briefly that 2 million out of 20 million is 10%. There's another interesting statistic when we study immigration, and that's the question of the rate of recidivism, otherwise known as the rate of return. How many of the immigrants who come make it here, stay here, versus struggle and return to their homeland? So some groups have a very high rate of recidivism, notably Hungarians and Italians, because Hungarians and Italians, many of them came here on what was called the padrone system, where they came as young men to work as contract workers. They made money to send back and then to take home with them. In other words, they weren't coming to find a new home. They were coming to make a buck. And then many of them returned to their homeland. With Jews, first of all, they never felt as if Russia, Poland, Lithuania, etc., was their home. It's always a pet peeve when I read an obituary and it says this person was the child of Russian or Polish immigrants. They weren't Russian or Polish immigrants. They were Jews. Poles didn't look at them as fellow Poles. Russians didn't look at them as fellow Russians, nor did they think of themselves as Russian or Poles. So they were already a diaspora people, a minority, a hyphenated group in the old country. They come to America, and the embrace of America is extremely powerful for them, because here they have finally found their golden Medina. Here they have finally found their promised land. This was at a time when Zionism was still a pipe dream. Very few people took seriously the idea that Jews could build a new nation in ancient Israel, in Palestine. It was a pipe dream. Until after the Balfour Declaration, it was hard to take it seriously. Most Jews voted with their feet. They came to New York City, which became de facto a new Jerusalem. And so we are about to see how those population numbers will increase so dramatically over the next few decades. Let's look at 1890. 1890 is now a decade into the immigrant period. Still only about 200,000 Jews are in New York, which is about 43% of American Jews across the board. Before the Civil War, New York was approximated 20% of American Jews. Sometimes it was higher, sometimes lower. Following the Civil War, into the period we're moving, it will always be above 40%, sometimes reaching 50%. It is still close to 40% today. So over a third, less than a half of all American Jews live in either New York City or the New York area. In 1900, the New York Jewish population hits 500,000, and that will be exactly 1/2 of the overall. There are now 1 million Jews in America. Look to the next side of the page, to 1910, and it is in the 19-teens that the number in New York will exceed 1 million. So from 1900 to, let's say, 1912, in 12 years, the number doubles from 500,000 to 1 million Jews. And notice that under 1912, we have the first breakdown of the different boroughs. Actually, look to 1917 for that. So in 1917, now 5 years later, right? 1912, it breaks 1 million. 5 years later, it goes to 1.5 million. So the numbers are really pouring in. One other statistic I need to give you is that of the Jews who arrive in New York City, unlike the Jewish immigrants of the previous century, the immigrants to New York at the turn of the century will almost all stay in New York. 70 to 80%, a clear majority of immigrants to New York stay in New York. Of those, 70 to 80% live in one neighborhood. Not Brownsville is a secondary immigrant enclave, but the Lower East Side. The Lower East Side will become, in the early decades of the 20th century, not only the most densely settled Jewish community in the world in history, it will become one of the most densely settled places on the face of the earth, comparable to Bombay and Calcutta. The way we measure population density is number of people per acre. And a normal number is 20, 30, 40. On the Lower East Side, it reached 90 and 100 people per acre. That many families were jammed together in the tenements of that area. It was, one should always recall, a very, very dirty, dangerous, unsanitary, crowded, crime-ridden, horrific in terms of the conditions of life, slum. So funny how it was called then the ghetto, the Jewish ghetto. And with all of the history of the word ghetto, you'd think that would seal the deal. That would tell us just how miserable it was. Somehow the word ghetto has become a little romanticized. It was a horrible slum. And what is so extraordinary about it is, despite the harsh living conditions of the Lower East Side, once again, we have an explosion of culture, of literature and language and poetry and theater and you name it in that very same neighborhood. So the best of times and the worst of times, it's an extraordinary period. But I just want to look at the numbers. So under 1917, you have a breakdown by borough, and you see that still at that moment of World War I, the majority live in Manhattan, 695,000. That's about half of that is on the Lower East Side. The rest are up in Harlem and elsewhere around Manhattan. The next largest is Brooklyn, over 500,000. The next largest is the Bronx, about 200,000. Right? And then Queens and Staten Island is still very small. That's in 1917. Turn the page. Let's look at 1937. And you'll see that in the 1930s, the number has surpassed 2 million. And that's the number I ask you to recall, that from, let's say, the 1920s through 1960, the middle of the 20th century, the number of Jews in New York City will more or less hold steady at 2 million people. There has never, in all of Jewish history, been that many Jews together in one place, in one city. Let me quickly give you some comparisons to Europe. Pre-World War II, the three largest Jewish cities were Warsaw, Lodz, and Odessa. Warsaw had over 300,000. Lodz and Odessa had about 150,000 apiece. Each one of those was thought of as a Jewish city because those numbers represented a very high percentage. Approximately a third of each of those cities was Jewish. 1/3. Imagine, 1 out of every 3 people in a city. It's extraordinary, isn't it? New York doesn't reach that higher percentage. You see here on under 1927, the highest, it never quite broke 30%. It hovered through most of the century. It will be closer to 1/4, about 25%. Even so, 1 out of every 4 people in New York City was a Jew from 1920s through 1960. It's amazing. Just sit with that for a moment. What does that mean? What ambiance does that create? What does that do to you as a Jewish person? Living in an environment, how many people here have been to Israel? Okay, almost all of us, right? So we all know what it's like to be on a bus where everybody on the bus is Jewish. We all know what it's like to be walking down the street and hearing nothing but Hebrew, right? We all know what that feels like, and I want to suggest to you it's one of the reasons we like going to Israel. We like that feeling. Short of that, however, in Diaspora, we have created a series of not quite all Jewish environments, as is the case in Israel, or mostly Jewish, but we have created a kind of an in-between. We have created communities and community life where being Jewish is not being part of a tiny minority. It's not being a drop in the bucket. It is being in a big, busy city, a big melting pot of different groups and ethnicities and nationalities, where Jews are dominant. Jews are 1 out of every 3, or in the case of New York, 1 out of every 4. Think about what that does to the nature of the city. Someone said Jew York before. You've also probably remembered the also negative assessment of Jesse Jackson, who called it Hymietown. Well, that was meant as an insult, but it still reflected a reality that there were so many Jews there that they had put their stamp on the city. They had turned it into a Jewish city, whatever that means. Right? You all know the famous line by Lenny Bruce, Lenny Bruce was a revolutionary comedian. I wrote my last book was partly about Lenny Bruce. Lenny Bruce once said that to him, if you live in New York or any other big city, if you live in New York City, you're Jewish. If you live in Butte, Montana, even if you're Jewish, you're Goyish. Right? So the idea, so that, you know, it's a good line. It's a cute aphorism, but it only could have been said in New York by a New Yorker, because for New Yorkers, whether we are secular or ultra-Orthodox or anything in between, the cultural symbiosis between Jews, Jewish life, and New York City has been extraordinary.